Hello and welcome everyone to our first summer read-along event of 2022. We are so glad to have you here. I'm going to let in our interpreter as a panelist, so please give me a second while we make sure that we have that in place. Thank you so much for being here, Robin. And we are going to get started in just a few moments. So welcome again to this event. We're so glad to have you all here, whether you are live or you are in person or watching later, not in person. But glad to have everyone here for this summer read-along event where we're going to be talking about teaching local history in Tulsa. My name is Sarah Sunling Blackburn. My pronouns are she, her. I am the Associate Director for Learning in Schools at Learning for Justice, which is a project of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I am joined by some fabulous panelists in conversation today as well. First, we have Cassandra Dillard, who is a senior writer at Learning for Justice, who's based in Montgomery, Alabama, and is also the author of the article Teaching Local History in Tulsa. We also have Akila Leach, a teacher in Tulsa Public Schools based in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who was part of the committee that wrote the 3 through 5 lesson plans about the Tulsa Race Massacre that we'll be talking about during this conversation. And I'm also joined by Jackie Jones, professional learning facilitator here at Learning for Justice, who is in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a former classroom high school history teacher, and who is one of the people who works with and provides trainings for educators across the country. They are all going to introduce themselves more in their own words briefly, but first I just wanted to set the stage a little bit for what's going to happen. So today we are talking about the article Teaching Local History in Tulsa. If you have not read this yet or read it before, Cassandra did an incredible job researching, reporting, and writing this story, which you can check out in the link I've just dropped into the chat. This will be the first of a series of these conversations. So each month through the summer, we will be meeting with writers, educators, and others to talk about the stories behind the stories that are featured in Learning for Justice. But we wanted to start with this one. This story really focuses on not just the history of the Tulsa Race Massacre, but the work to tell that history, to teach that history in schools, and what we can all learn from the importance of really understanding local histories. Here in the United States, where I live in Mississippi, where many of you live, across the region, across the country, there are so many efforts pushing back against teaching these truthful, these honest histories. And educators like Akila, who's with us today, and so many others have been working hard to make sure that these stories are not erased, but that they continue to be told so that we can learn from not just history, but also learn and better understand what's happening in our world today. So with that, I'm going to open this conversation to our panelists and have them each introduce themselves in their own words, and also share either when they first became aware of the Tulsa Race Massacre or why they think this is such an important story to talk about. So I'm going to ask Cassandra first, and then Akila, and then Jackie. Just introduce yourself and why are you part of this conversation?
Thanks, Sarah. I'm Cassandra Dillard. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the senior writer here at Learning for Justice. I've been with LFJ SPLC for over 4 years now, and a bulk of my work is just writing. I write a lot about history, equity in education, classroom culture, as well as identity and everything on the social justice spectrum. I'm based here in Montgomery, as Sarah said, and I'm happy to be here in this conversation. I honestly don't remember when I heard about the Tulsa Race Massacre. I think I learned about the Rosewood, Florida Massacre first, which was in the 1990s. And perhaps that was kind of my gateway into seeking more about similar histories. But regardless, I think I was an adult when I learned about it, and it wasn't in a classroom setting. And I think that's kind of the experience for most people when we talk about Tulsa and other race massacres.
Hello, my name is Akila Leach, and I am a fifth grade English Language Arts and Social Studies teacher. This is my 7th year teaching in Tulsa Public Schools. And a few years ago, Tulsa Public Schools set out to create lesson plans to teach every student about the Tulsa Race Massacre from 3rd through 12th grade. So every year from 3rd to 12th grade, students will have a lesson embedded in their social studies class that talks about the Tulsa Race Massacre from a different perspective. And I was on the team that helped with the elementary lessons. So I helped with the 3rd through 5th grade lessons. I am a native Tulsan, so I'm a product of Tulsa Public Schools. And I remember first learning about the Tulsa Race Massacre at some point in elementary school, but it was a very brief explanation about the Tulsa. It was called the Tulsa Race Riot at the time. And I remember learning about doing a unit on the history of Tulsa, and we went downtown. I just remember it probably because of the field trips, but we learned very like a blurb about there was an incident on an elevator and it sparked a riot and this community burned down. That was the extent that I learned. Historically, people don't really learn about the Tulsa Race Massacre in Tulsa or in Oklahoma, period. My father grew up here in Oklahoma, and he grew up going to segregated schools, so did all of his siblings. And he grew up not far from Langston University, which is the only historically Black college in Oklahoma. And he never learned about the Tulsa Race Massacre. And he didn't learn about it until he moved to Tulsa as an adult. So in his 30s is whenever he finally learned about it. So the lessons that Tulsa set out to do are very new, and hopefully it will, in the future, our students won't have to go through what so many of us who have grown up here in Tulsa and Oklahoma, realizing that we just completely miss a huge chunk of our history during our years in our education system.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jackie Jones. My pronouns are she and her. And I'm currently a professional learning facilitator here at Learning for Justice. A lot of my daily duties are to help educators across the nation kind of grapple with social justice education and figure out how to best implement it in their classrooms. Prior to being here, I spent 10 years as a high school history teacher in central New Jersey, where I taught everything from AP government and politics to US history and world history. But I also adjunct at 2 universities in New Jersey, where I help educators teach about the Holocaust and other social justice issues in their classrooms. And that's really where I got connected to Learning for Justice and felt like stepping into this new role outside the classroom would be a good fit. Even as a history teacher, I am so saddened to say that I hadn't learned about the Tulsa Race Massacre throughout all of my schooling, whether that was in K-12 education in New Jersey or going through my college career, and even in my master's program. There was nothing really that we didn't really talk about it. And so if there was a blurb in a textbook somewhere or a line in our curriculum, it was never really emphasized, and I never really taught it in my classroom, even though I could have and should have as a history teacher. And so it wasn't really until October, I believe, this past October, when I was here at LFJ, that Cassandra started talking about her research around this article, and really started to introduce our department to the Tulsa Race Massacre, the history behind it, And then through reading this article and doing my own research, really getting to kind of understand the context and history behind this event. So I think it's definitely important to talk about because more people need to know about it, and especially history teachers that are, talking about American history in their classroom. It should be something that is taught. And as I'll talk about later, something that can easily be connected to other local histories in your state, even if you're not from Oklahoma.
Thank you all so much for those introductions, for sharing your stories. I'm sure that as people are watching, they are also reflecting on their own knowledge, background knowledge, when they've heard about this, if they've heard about this event in history. And it really strikes me how it's not just, people who grew up outside of Oklahoma who don't necessarily know these stories. Akila, you talking about your father growing up there, in segregated Black communities in Tulsa, also not having access to these histories, really makes me think about why that happened to begin with and all of the effects. So we're going to move into a conversation. I have questions for the panelists, but if you are in the audience and you would like to submit a question, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom bar and submit those, and I will be monitoring that and folding in as many as I can throughout. Also, I will throw questions to the panelists, but I have also told them to feel free to interrupt me, interrupt each other, ask each other questions, jump in, add on each other's stories. So hopefully this is a meaningful and a pretty natural conversation, because I think it's a great example of how we are all wrestling with not just coming to terms with history again, but how do we share those stories? How do we elevate those stories in our communities and in our classrooms? So Akila, I want to kick it off to you because you really inspired me with that introduction, and want to hear more about how people, in particular students and young people, typically react to learning these histories. Why do you think that it's been so long that these histories were hidden? Why is it sometimes so fraught to bring them up now?
A lot of our students are aware that it's new to learn about the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so that, I think, naturally sparks their interest. They feel like I'm learning something important or something that was forbidden to know before, so that kids like to feel like they know they're learning something important. And so that really gets them interested. But I think the power of learning local history is that they can go down to Greenwood. So I have students that will tell me while we're in the middle of our unit that, hey, I asked my mom if we could just drive down to Greenwood, or hey, my family went down to Greenwood and we brought t-shirts, or so those are the students that are not from the Greenwood community or from North Tulsa. It connects them and makes them want to go and learn more, and they feel empowered, I think, to be able to go home and teach their family something. For the students that I have that are from the Greenwood community or from North Tulsa, they also feel connected because they recognize certain landmarks. They might recognize a park, because there's a park named after a lawyer from Greenwood, BC Franklin. And they're like, I know that park. I've played at that park before, or I know that church that's in this picture because I drive past it, or my grandma goes to that church. So there's a lot of power in learning about history that you can still see the remnants of right in front of you. You can go down and you can visit. That's different from learning about something that happened far away. But I think that's closeness, that proximity to with the history is also why it has been difficult for people to talk about, because those remnants are still there. There are survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre who are still alive and still fighting for justice today. Their families are still here. There are also families of people who were in the mob, in the angry mob that destroyed Greenwood. Their families are still here too. And the organizations and institutions that were complicit in allowing the massacre to happen and helping to cover it up, those still exist too. So I think that because people are connected that way, it can be hard because you're not just talking about history, you're talking about my family, or you're talking about this place that I work, place where I work at, that I realize the history of it, that makes me feel uncomfortable, you know? So I think that that's a big part of why what we call the conspiracy of silence is the shame surrounding the Tulsa race massacre, and any conversations to have it just brings shame because there was no justification for it to happen. So that, and then on the other side, for victims, the trauma that it caused and the pain that it caused for families.
Jackie, Akila just talked about a lot of emotions that can come up in the classroom. What advice do you have for educators who want to teach local histories, what we sometimes call hard histories, honest histories, and all the different feelings that might come up both for the students and also honestly for us, the educators ourselves?
Yeah, great question, Sarah. So I want to bring up something that Dr. Clark Adams in the article is actually quoted as saying, or paraphrased as saying, is that there's more of a devastating emotional effect on students if they don't learn the real history and the true history around not just their communities, but just true hard histories in general. And I think that that's really important to kind of center this response around, because so often teachers are afraid of, saying the wrong thing, or, if their positionality is such that they're not really connected or a part of the conversation, that they feel like, they might not be able to talk about something if it's not their own experience. And it's important to recognize that, but it's also important to remember that when you're teaching students about these difficult histories and hard histories, like Akila said, like, they want to learn, right? They're engaged in that learning process because they feel like it's important, and it's fostering that sense of empathy and compassion, that even if it's not your own community that it's happening to, you can still draw those connections and threads that help them feel more connected to maybe their own community, or even just to the global community that will eventually allow them to, be more active participants in their communities and, in our society. And so something to consider is making sure before you enter these conversations that you're finding ways to set up your classroom in a way that is a safe and brave environment, right, for your students to feel like they can talk about the emotions that will ultimately arise from having these conversations. And so Akila actually mentions in the article too that in all of the lessons that they created for the Tulsa Race Massacre, they all start with a before you begin section that kind of has this, community builder, a safe way of bringing your students into these conversations before you start digging into the history behind it. And similarly at Learning for Justice, we have a publication called Let's Talk, which is about having critical conversations around race and racism. And these are just some tools that you can start using to be able to establish that classroom environment and that classroom culture that will allow you and your students to say potentially wrong things, or feel like you can make mistakes and still have conversations around these histories that are so important to tell. So emotions are going to be there. We want students to talk about their emotions. They're going to be feeling things. And it's really just about creating that foundation for those conversations to happen, because they need to happen.
That's really great advice. Thank you for both of those. I want to pivot it to Cassandra, who is our author here, who did a lot of the reporting and bringing the story to a wider audience about, telling the story around the Tulsa Race Massacre. So Cassandra, why was it important for you to tell this story? And then maybe just talk to us a little bit about what you were thinking in terms of your audience, or anything that you wanted to share that you didn't get to share. Just talk to us a little bit about your process and your thinking behind it. And you're on mute.
Oh,
There you are.
can you hear me?
Yeah.
It was important to share this story because, well, for one thing, the climate that we're currently in, where there are lawmakers, policymakers, activist groups who don't want us to learn this history and these stories. Um, a couple of years ago, I wrote about the importance of learning local history, as all history is local history. And what happens in our individual communities has a profound effect on all of us, right? So I wanted to capture in Tulsa what people there who live there felt about this history and how they lifted up the history and how they're making connections between the past and the present. When we talk about difficult or hard history, Tulsa is one of those places that's top of mind because it's been kind of um, it's been talked about a lot in recent years in mainstream media. Um, so it was kind of easy to get in that way to illustrate that even though this was a horrific and traumatizing event that seemed that kind of is surprising to people, there were lots of Tulsas though. And I think Tulsa is a point that you can start with to see similarities in other communities and inspire people to do their own digging in their own communities and their own backyards about this. As for educators, I wanted to make sure that they understood the value of uplifting their history in their backyards, especially when they're planning lessons around history. Many of your local histories aren't in the textbooks. So there's, and teachers know that that you have to supplement a lot of things that are not in the, a lot of subjects and issues that aren't in the textbook. Teaching this to young people will help students better understand the world that they currently live around, the issues around inequities in education, around poverty, even health outcomes. They see these on the daily, stark differences and inequities. And if you could dig and examine your history, you can see when and how those things began and then it's still with you. I think that history is really not the past. Like we live, it's a living thing, it's living with us, and we see history every day. We see the results of those past decisions and incidences. But it sounds cliche-ish, but if we don't learn from the past, we're doomed to repeat it. And I think that if we open our eyes to see and make those connections between the past and what's happening today, we can forge a better future. One way to put it in perspective, an example is if a community experienced white flight or a massacre like what happened in Tulsa, students can see, if they're examining the history, they can see the parallel or the connection between where that incident happened and what's happening today. For example, in Tulsa, and Akila can probably expand, there's still stark differences between North Tulsa, where the massacre happened, and the rest of the city. And it's not a coincidence, right? So people can see where you live, how you live, the social and economic status of people in the community was all set from what happened in the past in our history. So that's some of the things, that's what's important in talking about the history and uplifting what happens in your community, because it has the biggest effect on you, from the first place that has the greatest effect on you, and it connects to how you live today. Is there another part of your question, Sarah? I'm sorry.
No, that's good, because you were talking about kind of big picture. So I'm going to pivot from, I already told you all I was probably going to deviate from the questions, because I have a great question that came in through the Q&A. This question is for Akila, and I think it relates to a lot about what Cassandra was just talking about with kind of the current climate around teaching histories. So the question is, have you had to deal with any pushback from white families in teaching this history? And if so, how have you dealt with it?
So because our district has taken a stance that we're going to teach this and they have required everyone to teach it, then they have taken upon themselves to handle pushback. So if there was a parent that had an issue, then I wouldn't have to handle it on my own. They'd be directed to call someone in the teaching and learning department of our district, and it would be dealt on that level, and they would explain how these lessons still comply with the laws that have recently been passed to try to keep the true history from being taught. So that we're fortunate in that. I think that if I were just trying to teach this on my own, then maybe it would be different. But since it's not, Miss Leach just sitting here trying to indoctrinate our children, it's coming from the district and not just from me personally. So that really is important. It really is helpful to have that sort of backup.
I'm gonna hop in on this one too, Akila, because this is a question we've been getting all year from our educators in all of our different workshops. And something exciting that we're coming out with is actually a resource for advocating for honest history and like what educators can do in their classrooms. And so that's something to just kind of keep your eyes peeled out for. Hopefully by the start of the school year, the publication will be released, and we are going to offer some workshops around the resource as well, to try and help our educators see that they still can advocate for these honest histories and teach these honest histories despite a lot of the laws that are in place in many states across the country.
Thank you all for that. I think it's top of mind for a lot of people. And actually, what I'm going to do is kind of synthesize the last few questions to something for all of you, and then we'll take any remaining questions in the Q&A. I saw one more come in already. And so everyone else, if you have questions, please drop them in now. We'll be sure to get to that at the end. So the question for all of you is just, what advice do you have for people who are seeking to elevate or find out or tell local histories, to teach local histories, to support their school community in doing this work? Just what advice do you have to give about teaching local histories in Tulsa or generally? Whoever wants to kick us off, go right ahead.
I can go. A couple of things that come to mind. And I think Jackie brought it up about the balance of not being afraid to say the wrong things or do the wrong things, and then creating a classroom that's conducive to have those conversations. One of the things that I spotlighted in the article was the self-reflection and the pre-work that the teachers did there before they dug into the work. They did a lot of workshopping, and they sat with feelings. They were in a deep immersion of history, and they were prepared for not only their own feelings, but what their students might bring up. So that's important. That's an important piece, to be mindful, to have those difficult conversations and dig into your own biases before you get started, and to sit with those feelings. But advice for anyone, even outside of educators, is to start with your family and your elders in your community first. I know that people are, that in your own community may be filled with memories and stories about a local history event or about your community. The caveat is, though, that those experiences might be too painful, and those memories may be tucked away for a reason. So it's a good idea to be mindful of that. And that's okay if they don't want to speak about that. But for people who are willing to share their stories, it's good to have them open up and welcome them into your, whether it's a community gathering, your classroom, your home, to talk about whatever subject that you're trying to learn. Another source would be the local library. Typically, your town's paper record would have archived issues dating back to its founding and cataloged in the local library. So that's a good start. And local and regional museums are another great start.
I think the advice I would give is to find a way to tie in local history to a broader context of what you're teaching. So because our students are learning about it every year, we didn't want to write these lessons in a way that they're just doing the same lesson over and over and over. And so, especially on the secondary level, it's really their lessons are really embedded in what they are learning in geography. So there's, and maybe in 6th and 7th grade, they talk about redlining and gentrification because the focus is on geography. In world history lesson in high school, they are comparing how governments make amends. And then they bring Tulsa into that. How could Tulsa make amends? So how have governments over history around the world made amends after atrocities? So there's a way, because local history doesn't happen in a vacuum, there's a way to connect what has happened in your town, even if it's using a primary source from your a local primary source document to tie into another unit that you're doing that's related. That could be a start. That would be my advice.
Coming from that same educator perspective, I feel a lot of what Akila was just saying, but I think the one thing that I would add to that is the scaffolding component. You know, and Akila, please speak, jump in if I'm misspeaking for you, but as like a 3rd grade teacher, 3rd graders have the capacity to handle these conversations, right? Probably not the same way, or definitely not the same way as a 12th grader might have a conversation, or the types of content that you might specifically expose to a 12th grader versus a 3rd grader, but they can start to engage in these conversations. And so finding ways to scaffold in not just the content about what you're teaching, but also the conversations around identity, conversations around what makes a community, conversations about like, who are we within our community, right? How do we fit in our own community, and having conversations that could then dovetail easily into a lesson around a local historical event. So that would be the one thing I would add is that identity work, understanding who you are, how that fits in your community, and then what is your community? How can you identify it, and how can you then talk about the local histories that might be there, and then make those other connections to local histories in other parts of the country. And like Akila said, one of their lesson plans is awesome around the world history connection, because so often world history teachers are like, I can't teach this, or it doesn't fit in my context, but like it does. And so finding ways to make those connections are really important, and can have incredible impact on your students.
I love all of this advice, and in particular because it models the kind of, I don't know, for lack of a better word, like the intellectual humility that it takes to be an effective educator, which is that we don't know everything. Sometimes we want to wait until we know everything about something before we talk about it with our students, when in reality, there is no such thing as knowing everything about everything. And so sometimes it is learning alongside, learning with, creating the conditions where learning can happen together, and being open to changing up what we do, to incorporating more, to really centering the humans at the heart of history and everything that we do. I have a question from the chat, or from the Q&A, that is probably for Akila. Maybe Cassandra, you can jump in on this, but can you talk about why Oklahoma was seen as the promised land? Where does that come from?
Yes, so prior to becoming a state, Oklahoma was seen as a promised land because there weren't Jim Crow laws yet at the time. And there was kind of a hodgepodge of group of people that were coming into Oklahoma. The Native Americans came through the Trail of Tears, and there were settlers coming from all over. There were enslaved Black people who came with the Native Americans. But then there were people from different parts of the South that were moving to Oklahoma. And then during the Oklahoma Land Run, land was being given away and people could set a plot, grab a plot of land and start building their future. So that's why it was kind of seen as this promised land. There were even boosters, Black boosters who would go and try to recruit African Americans to move to Oklahoma. In fact, Oklahoma the hope was for it to be a Black state, and there were actually over 50 all Black towns in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But then Oklahoma became a state in 1907, and the very first law on the books was a Jim Crow law. And so students actually learn about that history through our lessons because it ties into the spirit of how Greenwood was built. So Greenwood wasn't just this neighborhood in Tulsa that was kind of like an island on its own. There was a spirit around Oklahoma of Black towns, and some of them still exist around Oklahoma. So that was a great question. Thank you for that question.
Thank you for sharing that history with us. We are going to start wrapping up. I have a few things to plug, some announcements to make for everyone who's here, but I do want to make space if there's anything that anyone wanted to say that you didn't feel like you had a chance to say yet, jump in. Okay, well, I'm going to keep calling on you as we do some of these plugs. So Cassandra, I'm going to reshare the article in the chat with everyone, this particular article, but can you talk to us a little bit about the work that you're doing, elevating local histories in general, and what we maybe should be looking out for?
Yeah, so Tulsa, again, a couple of years ago, I wrote about the value of learning and teaching about your local history. Tulsa was like the beginning of a series of articles that will be ongoing. I recently wrote about Juneteenth and Galveston, the connections that they're making and how they're uplifting their history there. And in the future, in the coming weeks and months, I will also be looking at other communities, mostly in the South, but in many different places where hopefully it'll be a model or at least inspire people to use it as a template to dig into their own local histories and teach young people about their community's history. So you can just keep an eye on our website, through our blog, in our newsletter. We'll post it. That'll be ongoing for a little while now.
Thank you so much for that. Akila, there's got a lot of love about the lesson plans and resources on the Tulsa Race Massacre. So I just shared the link to those again. I know you wanted to point out that these can be used by people everywhere, not just in Tulsa, but can you just give us a little bit of an overview? What can people find when they go to this link?
Yeah, so all of our lessons are organized by grade, and they are each, they're organized by compelling questions. So you can look at those questions as kind of like a menu. They're by grade level because we don't want kids to learn the same thing over and over in Tulsa. But if you're not a Tulsa educator, you can literally just pick any lesson and adjust it for your classroom. And there are slide decks, there's resources, there's videos, and interactive activities to go with each of the lessons, and you can just kind of choose what works for you in your classroom.
It's great. I love them. We've been working with the inquiry design model a little bit here at Learning for Justice as well, and just seeing these beautiful IDMs made me so happy. So thank you for helping make these reality for people. Jackie, I would love you to talk a little bit about some other ways that people can engage with Learning for Justice, in particular our professional development offerings.
Sure. So we are currently in the selection process for our second iteration of our Teaching Hard History professional learning cohort. So if you didn't get a chance to apply this time around, definitely keep your eyes peeled for some spring or summer opportunities to work with our framework around American slavery. But if you want to join us for any of our other workshops, we will be opening up our open enrollments are already open on our website for the fall. We'll be looking at our social justice standards. We'll be looking at our Speak Up framework, and we'll be looking at the new advocacy resource that I talked about earlier, which I'm hoping is going to be a very popular choice, and hope that it is very helpful for all of you that are continuing to do this hard and important work in your schools and your classrooms.
That's wonderful. So thank you again to all of you so much. Thank you for your time, for being here. Akila talked a little bit about textbooks and how many textbooks did not tell the story. Even textbooks produced in Oklahoma were not telling the story of the Tulsa Race Massacre in Oklahoma. And so our conversation next month will be focused on this very topic. We'll be reading the article Going Beyond the Textbook. I've put the link in the chat, so read it, join us again for this conversation. More information about the precise date will come out shortly. Also, as Cassandra said, please subscribe to Learning for Justice through our website. You can subscribe to our newsletter. We are on all the social medias. Stay up to date, stay in touch, share what you're doing in your practice as well, and help to spread this work with educators that you know as well. And with that, I would just like to thank first the panelists. Thank you, Akila, for your work, for your teaching, for your advocacy. Thank you, Cassandra, for your reporting, for your writing, for uplifting stories. Thank you, Jackie, for your work in guiding and facilitating and helping educators really promote justice and equity in their practice, and to create inclusive and inclusive spaces for all young people. And thank you, Robin, for being here as our interpreter as well. Also, thank you to everyone for attending. We hope to see you again. This video will be posted on the Learning for Justice website shortly, and you can also watch it and share it from there. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful rest of your week, and so appreciative of your time. Bye, y'all.